June 17, 1944, Saipan. The air hangs thick with burnt cordite and coral dust. The sun bleaches everything: metal, bone, and fear. American Marines crawl forward through jagged volcanic ridges. Somewhere ahead, the Earth itself seems alive. Japanese machine guns breathe fire from unseen mouths in the rock. The Marines have tried grenades, satchel charges, even point-blank rifle fire. Nothing silences the cave. Then, a new sound cuts through the chaos. A low metallic growl. The silhouette of a tank crawls over a ridge, smaller than the usual Sherman, scarred and improvised. On its turret, a short, stubby nozzle replaces the cannon. A sudden hiss, a roar, a liquid jet of fire arcs forward, 20, maybe 30 yards, splashing across the bunker's opening. The flame crawls along the walls, bends inside, and swallows the dark. The explosion of heat and screaming air lasts seconds, but the effect is permanent. Marines stare in stunned silence. For the first time in the Pacific, they have unleashed a tank that breathes fire. That moment was no accident. It was the beginning of a terrifying new chapter in island warfare. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a slow, grinding siege. The United States, advancing westward across the Central Pacific, faced a Japanese defense unlike anything seen in Europe. Every island, from Tarawa to Peleliu, had become a fortress. Coral sand was shaped into bunkers. Hills were carved into tunnels. Caves were reinforced with steel doors and lava rock. Japanese engineers and soldiers understood one truth: they could not match American firepower in open battle, so they vanished underground. On Saipan, Tinian, and later Iwo Jima, the Imperial Japanese Army built complex networks of interlocking positions, pillboxes linked by tunnels, cave systems buried deep enough to survive naval bombardment, artillery hidden behind reverse slopes. These defenses were designed not to win, but to bleed. Every cave entrance, every bunker embrasure forced the Americans to come close enough for grenades, bayonets, and point-blank gunfire. American Marines and Army infantry learned this lesson in blood. On Tarawa, thousands fell clearing small patches of sand. On Peleliu, flamethrower teams and demolition men burned through caves for weeks, their life expectancy measured in minutes. Riflemen couldn't get close without being shredded. Tanks, though powerful, faced their own limits. Narrow beaches, steep ridges, and hidden mines left them vulnerable. The M4 Sherman's cannon could smash concrete, but not reach the men inside the labyrinth of stone. Its machine guns couldn't angle down into cave mouths dug below ground level. The Japanese learned to wait, silent, until the tank passed, then strike from behind with magnetic mines or suicidal charges. By early 1944, Marine commanders realized they needed a new way to fight a buried enemy. Fire, once primitive, had become essential again. Handheld flamethrowers worked, but their short range and exposed operators made them nearly suicidal to use against fortified positions. A better solution was forming in workshops far from the front. In Hawaii, a group of engineers, chemists, and tank mechanics from the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service and the Marine Corps began an experiment to mount a flamethrower inside a tank. The idea was both simple and horrifying: to deliver fire through armor, combining the reach of a vehicle with the terror of liquid flame. They worked quietly under the Pacific Ocean Area's command, experimenting with pressure systems, naval fuel mixtures, and tank modification. Their goal wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was survival. Every day on the islands, Marines were dying in front of sealed caves. Every bunker became a tomb they had to storm by hand. A flamethrower tank could do what no shell could: crawl to the cave's mouth and send fire deep inside. It could make entrenched defenders move, panic, surrender, or die before they ever saw the enemy's face. It was a brutal solution to a brutal problem. And in a workshop on Oahu, they were about to give that fire a name. In early 1944, on the island of Oahu, a handful of men worked in the heat of corrugated iron workshops. They were engineers, welders, chemists, and soldiers. A small detachment of the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service, CWS, and the Marine Corps. Their mission was to turn an idea into a weapon, to give fire a home inside armor. Colonel George F. Unmocked led the effort under the Pacific Ocean Area's command. His team studied everything from British crocodile flame tanks to naval fuel spray systems, but the Pacific needed something lighter, faster, and simple enough to be built in theater. The M3 Stuart, an older light tank now considered obsolete for frontline combat, became their test platform. They stripped away its main 37mm mm gun and replaced it with a flamethrower unit derived from the Navy's Mark I Ronson design. It fired thickened gasoline, napalm-like fuel before the term existed, using compressed nitrogen to project a continuous stream of fire up to 40 yards. External tanks were first mounted on the rear hull, then later built inside the armor to reduce vulnerability. The design was crude, the engineering improvised, but the effect was extraordinary. The men nicknamed it Satan. The name fit. During testing on Oahu ranges, when the nozzle hissed and the first orange plume leapt forward, the air filled with a deep, vibrating roar. Lava-like flame poured into mock cave openings, licking along the walls before collapsing in a cloud of oily smoke. The fuel stuck, clung, and burned even after the operator released the trigger. Training crews was as vital as building machines. Operators had to master the rhythm of bursts, 3-second jets, controlled interval, pressure checks. Inside the cramped hull, temperatures rose dangerously high. Fire safety drills became a ritual. Vent hatches cracked open, extinguishers within reach, a backup crew always standing by. The project drew quiet interest from Marine commanders preparing for the Marianas Campaign. Infantry flamethrowers had proven their worth, but at devastating cost in lives. A tank-mounted system promised protection and persistence, the ability to stay in the fight after one burst instead of dying beside it. By May 1944, the first operational batch of M3 Satans stood ready on Oahu docks, painted olive drab, hoses coiled, turrets modified. Each carried roughly 170 gallons of thickened fuel, enough for 80 to 100 short bursts. The men who watched their loading to Saipan knew they were sending something new, something the Japanese had never faced. When the ships set sail, no one could predict exactly what would happen when armor and fire combined on a real battlefield. But those who had seen the tests understood. The Pacific's dark caves were about to meet their match. That match would be struck on Saipan. They called the tank a machine. The crews called it a small hell. Inside the Stuart's cramped hull, the world narrowed to levers, gauges, and breath. The driver's back pressed to warmed steel. The operator's hands brushed hose fittings that carried boiling fuel. The turret hatch was both a shield and a confession booth. Men practiced the rhythm of fire, a quick burst, a pause, a judgment. Each burst meant heat, noise, and smoke that pushed back into the tank. Temperatures climbed, metal sang. The crew learned to read the tank like a man reads a pulse. Pressure, smell, tone. Behind the armor, infantry watched with a different face. For riflemen who had seen friends fall clearing caves with hand flamethrowers and satchel charges, the sight of flame arriving inside a tank felt like relief and shame mixed. Relief because the immediate danger of crawling within arm's reach of an embrasure diminished. Shame because fire exacted a terrible visible toll. Men who had to enter blasted caves afterwards spoke of shock, of heat-blown hair, of scorched equipment, and of quiet bodies found where voices had been moments before. The crews and the EE riflemen developed a quiet code. The tank would burn the opening. The infantry would secure the lip. Engineers would follow with charges or dozers. Each roll was small. Each roll kept men alive. For Japanese troops entrenched in tunnels and caves, the arrival of flame altered the rules of engagement. Their doctrine in 1944 emphasized holding ground, mutual support, and the willingness to die rather than retreat. These were not naive fighters. They were craftsmen of defense. Caves were stocked with supplies, linked by galleries, and designed to endure bombardment. Flame was a personal terror. It did not simply blast masonry. It consumed air and light inside confined spaces. Where artillery shattered walls, Flame crept into every recess. Defenders who had trained to endure shelling found a different enemy in heat that clung and smoked. In some cases, Japanese troops attempted to counter with water reservoirs, sandbags at entrances, or by sealing galleries. In others, they sallied out to attack tanks with explosives at night. Many commanders issued standing orders to accept annihilation over surrender. Flame intensified this calculus. It pressured defenders into constrained choices: stay and risk. The suffocating heat. Attempt to break out into prepared killing zones, or remain and await the end. The presence of flame changed the psychology of defense. It shortened decisions and magnified desperation. Tactically, the flame tank did something ordinary weapons could not. It put controllable, protected fire at the very lip of a position. Doctrine evolved from experience. Before flame tanks, combined arms meant artillery, naval gunfire, airstrikes, then infantry assault. Those tools could reduce concrete and crush barbed wire, but they could not always clear interconnected subterranean networks. A tank that could project burning fuel into an entrance allowed infantry to avoid piecemeal approaches and to coordinate assaults with predictable suppression windows. Commanders began to integrate flame tanks into deliberate sequences. Recon would mark likely galleries. Artillery would suppress flanks. Flame tanks would advance under smoke and machine gun cover to the embrasure. A standard tactic emerged. A short, intense burst into the opening, followed immediately by an infantry assault to occupy the lip while engineers prepared demolition or close the gallery. Dozers would then clear rubble and create firing platforms. Communication mattered. Hand signals, pre-arranged whistles, and short-range radios linked crews and assault team. Tactical success was rarely spectacular. It was incremental. One burned entrance, one cleared gallery, one secured cave at a time. The device itself was straightforward and fragile. The early M3 Satan installations used a pressure-fed system to push thickened fuel through a nozzle. The fuel, heavy-end with gel agents, adhered to surfaces and burned longer than plain gasoline. Compressed gas provided range. The design choices reflected trade-offs. More fuel meant fewer bursts before refilling. Internal tanks reduced vulnerability but complicated crew space. External tanks were easier to install but made the vehicle a target. Mechanically, the biggest threats were heat transfer into the hull and the danger of sympathetic ignition during hits. Engineers fitted thermal shields, relief valves, and emergency venting. Crews practiced dump procedures to jettison fuel if necessary. Range claims varied by report. In practice, effective reach was measured not by yards on paper, but by the ability to reach into galleries and to coat insides with burning fuel. The nozzle's arc and depression had to be adapted to the terrain. Cave mouths were often lower than a turret's sight line. This led to improvised mounting angles, added elevation devices, and sometimes tilting platforms that let an operator point the torch slightly downward into an entrance. Logistics followed technology. Fuel depots, refilling procedures, and maintenance cycles became part of the campaign's supply chain. Taken together, these human, enemy, tactical, and technical threads formed a single fabric of warfare. Each made the other different. Crews developed techniques because engineers shaped machines. Commanders changed plans because defenders adapted. Technology survived where tactics respected its limits. If these threads show how flame tanks changed the fighting, they also point toward harder questions: leadership, law, and the ethics of using fire at close quarters. The arrival of the Satan tanks posed new challenges for Marine leadership. Major General Holland M. Howlin' Mad Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, understood that the Pacific Islands were not just battles of courage. They were battles of engineering. The Flamethrower tank was a tactical invention, but it required a doctrinal shift. Firepower had to be orchestrated, not improvised. In Hawaii, Unmacht's reports convinced senior staff that the success of flame armor depended on structure. Smith's officers established a new coordination model that tied tank battalions directly to engineer companies and infantry assault platoons. The formula became known as the Flame Section. It was small, self-contained, and methodical. 1 or 2 flame tanks, 2 dozer tanks, demolition engineers, and a rifle platoon. The rhythm was rehearsed. Tanks advance under suppressive fire, engineers mark targets, infantry protect the vehicle's flanks. Every after-action report from Saipan refined the playbook. Commanders learned that flame had to be rationed like ammunition. Firing too early wasted fuel. Waiting too long risked ambush. Coordination with air and artillery became essential, creating a layered rhythm of pressure, bombardment, flame, infantry assault, and consolidation. The leadership doctrine that emerged was pragmatic, not emotional. The weapon's value lay in its precision, not its terror. By the time of the Tinian landings, Marine tank battalions had clear operating procedures for flame tanks, pre-briefed objectives, strict safety ranges, and integration with smoke screens. Leaders like Colonel Unmacht and Colonel Unmacht's counterparts in field units emphasized restraint. Every burst of fire was to achieve a tactical purpose. The goal was not destruction for spectacle, but speed, to end resistance with fewer casualties on both sides. That doctrine would become the blueprint for all Pacific assaults that followed. Every man who saw a flamethrower tank in action understood that it was more than a machine. It was a moral problem. Fire had always existed on battlefields, from ancient Greek fire to the incendiary raids of the Second World War. But in the Pacific, fire became personal. It was directed not at cities or factories, but at men inside caves and bunkers. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 prohibited weapons causing unnecessary suffering, but they did not explicitly ban flamethrowers. To American commanders, legality was clear. To the soldiers who operated them, justification was harder. Many Marines later said that the weapon saved lives, that the alternative to flame was weeks of fighting with grenades and explosives that killed both sides by the hundreds. You had to use it, one operator recalled. It was them or us. The Japanese defenders, bound by orders to fight to the death, rarely surrendered. For them, fire was the ultimate end. From a distance, historians later debated whether the flamethrower's horror outweighed its necessity. In the moment, there was no debate. There was only survival. The weapon was legal, but its moral gravity was immense. Some American officers restricted its use to clearly fortified targets. Others, hardened by loss, expanded it to any resistance pocket. Civilians on Saipan, many forced into cave shelters, added another layer of tragedy. Reports noted that after combat, many burned positions contained both soldiers and non-combatants who had been trapped inside. The battlefield rarely distinguished one from the other. In the official post-war analysis, the U.S. Marine Corps defended the weapon's use as essential and proportionate to the tactical challenge. Yet even within the Corps, veterans admitted that fire carried a different kind of memory. Not the pride of victory, but the heaviness of necessity. Fire had won ground, but it left marks on those who wielded it. The success at Saipan and Tinian transformed the flame tank from an experiment into a requirement. Reports from the Marianas Campaign circulated quickly across the Pacific Ocean area's headquarters. By late 1944, the command ordered the creation of standardized flame tanks based on the M4 Sherman, a more durable, spacious platform that could carry greater fuel loads and offer better protection. This evolution produced the POA CWS H-1 model, the Pacific Ocean Area's Chemical Warfare Service H-1 conversion. Unlike the improvised Satan, it used an internal fuel system, a refined projector, and improved reliability under tropical conditions. The H-1's debut at Iwo Jima and Okinawa would mark the weapon's maturity. Operationally, flame tanks became integral to pre-landing plans. Intelligence teams mapped cave systems using aerial photos and captured documents. Every beachhead had designated flame sections, each attached to infantry regiments. Assault schedules included flame runs as fixed phases, not ad hoc responses. At the same time, the Japanese command evolved countermeasures. They deepened tunnels, built fire baffles, stored water and sand near entrances, and planned night raids to destroy tanks. Some garrisons adopted flame traps, forcing tanks to approach blind angles. Others rigged suicide teams to rush burning tanks under smoke cover. In response, American units reinforced flame tanks with escort infantry and covering fire. Night perimeters grew tighter. Recovery teams developed protocols for refueling and maintenance under combat conditions. Flame tanks even gained radio coordination with close support aircraft to mark cave targets for napalm strikes. The weapon had become part of a complex ecosystem, a blend of armor, chemistry, and communication. By the final months of the war, reports from Okinawa would show that the flamethrower tank, once a desperate improvisation, had become an instrument of doctrine. It represented how innovation in war travels from need to norm, from chaos to method. The lessons learned on Saipan and Tinian would soon ignite again on the black sands of Iwo Jima. Bataillon 1944, Saipan. The Marianas Campaign was underway. The island's ridges were scorched, black by naval bombardment, yet Japanese resistance remained unbroken. Every ridge, every draw, every cave concealed fire. The U.S. 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had landed under heavy shelling, and now, days into the fight, they faced the brutal core of Saipan's defense. Interlocked cave systems dug into Mount Tapachau and the surrounding hills. Ordinary tanks couldn't get close. Infantry flamethrowers were burning through fuel and men in equal measure. Engineers were dying at cave mouths before they could even pull a satchel fuse. It was here that the new weapon, the Satan, was ordered forward for its first trial in combat. The tank rumbled toward a coral ridge near Garapan. Its turret bore the stubby barrel of the flamethrower, its sides already scratched and scarred by shrapnel. A Marine observer marked the position of a cave entrance spewing machine gun fire. The Stuart moved up under covering smoke. From 40 yards, the operator flipped the pressure valve. A hiss filled the hull. Then came the roar. A solid ribbon of fire leapt from the nozzle, striking the entrance like a hammer of heat. Inside, oxygen vanished in a flash. The flame clung to the walls, turned air into choking vapor. When the smoke cleared seconds later, the cave was silent. Observers were stunned. For days they had thrown everything, grenades, mortars, tank shells, at those openings with little effect. Now one short burst had neutralized an entire position. Marines advanced cautiously, rifles ready. Inside, the scene was pure devastation. Word spread fast. Platoons began requesting flame tanks for every major assault. On the following days, the Satans led attacks against bunker lines near Kanoa, using fuel bursts to drive defenders out into waiting rifle fire. They operated in teams, one tank firing while another covered or refueled. The combination of armor and flame broke the stalemate that had bled men for days, but the weapon's power came at a cost. Japanese counterattacks intensified. At night, soldiers crept through ravines to place explosives under the tanks. Several Satans were lost that way, burned from the outside by men willing to die to stop them. Crews began sleeping inside their vehicles, engines running, machine guns ready. The war had grown smaller, hotter, closer. Reports from company commanders noted something new in combat psychology. Japanese fire discipline, once steady and relentless, broke under the sight of flame. Bunkers went silent faster. Some defenders chose suicide rather than face burning. The psychological shock was as decisive as the mechanical one. American officers studied every engagement carefully. They recorded fuel usage, effective range, and tactical limits. The Satans could clear a small area quickly, but they carried limited fuel and needed constant resupply. They could not replace artillery or airstrikes, but they could open a path where nothing else could. By the end of June, Unmacht's design had proven itself. The reports sent back to Oahu were blunt, highly effective against caves and bunkers, essential for future island operations. In the words of one Marine lieutenant, written in a field notebook later recovered, "It's not the sound that gets them. It's the silence after." That silence marked the turning point. Saipan was proof. But the real transformation, the birth of flame warfare as a system, would unfold on the neighboring island of Tinian just weeks later, July 24, 1944. The island of Tinian lay just 3 miles south of Saipan, smaller, flatter, but just as fortified. The lessons of Saipan had been read, copied, and turned into orders. The U.S. 4th Marine Division went ashore knowing exactly how to use its new weapon. For the first time in the Pacific, flame tanks weren't an experiment. They were part of the plan. The beaches were deceptive. Smooth coral shelves, open fields of cane, and beyond them, low limestone hills riddled with caves. The Japanese had fortified the interior in depth, confident that their reverse-slope positions could hold off armor and artillery alike. But this time, the Americans came prepared. From the first morning, the attack was textbook. Reconnaissance had mapped every major cave mouth. Engineers had plotted refueling points and pre-built flame sections. Flame tanks, dozers, demolition teams, and infantry platoons, each one trained to move as a single living unit. Air strikes and naval guns had softened the surface, but the defenders waited deep underground. They knew fire would come. By midday, the first Satan moved up a narrow lane flanked by Marines with rifles ready. A cave mouth flashed with machine gun fire. The tank halted, angled its stubby gun downward, and released a blast. A column of thick fire shot forward, bending slightly with the wind, striking the rock and rolling inward. A second burst followed, shorter, measured. The cave went silent. Within minutes, engineers moved in with charges, sealing the entrance. Elsewhere, dozers pushed berms to shield flame tanks from snipers. Riflemen marked new openings with colored smoke. Communication was precise, almost surgical. The chaotic improvisation of Saipan had evolved into choreography. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Dillon, observing from a ridge, wrote in his after-action report, "The effect of coordinated flame and infantry is immediate. Caves that resisted all previous bombardment are neutralized within minutes." What began as horror on Saipan became efficiency on Tinian. The weapon had found its doctrine. The Japanese defenders adapted fast. They aimed artillery at flame tanks, knowing their fuel made them vulnerable. Suicide teams hid in trenches and charged from behind once the tanks fired. But American coordination blunted these attempts. Infantrymen stayed close, forming living armor around the tanks. When counterattacks came, rifle fire and grenades tore through them before they could reach the fuel tanks. The pace of the operation stunned observers. In less than 10 days, Tinian's main defensive line collapsed. What had taken weeks on earlier islands now happened in days. Bunker by bunker, the combined assault of dozers, infantry, and flame tanks cleared ground at a speed unseen in previous campaigns. The Japanese garrison, cut off and burned out of its final redoubts, faced annihilation. Few surrendered. Many chose to die in place, some by their own hand. For the Marines, it was grim work, methodical, exhausting, and unforgettable. You could smell the island before you saw it, one sergeant recalled years later. That was the smell of the war we fought. At headquarters, the reports were clinical. Flame tanks used 12 average bursts per tank, 60-80 average. Cave neutralization time, under 10 minutes. Tank losses, minimal. Infantry casualties, reduced dramatically. Those numbers spoke louder than any speech. When Tinian was declared secure on August 4, 1944, the Marine Corps had done more than win another island. It had proven a concept that controlled fire, applied through armor, could overcome the Pacific's deadliest terrain. And so, the flame tank, born in an Oahu workshop, tested in Saipan's agony, became doctrine. The next landings would not go without it. The Pacific had entered its era of engineered fire, but every triumph carries a cost. For the men who operated those tanks, the images of Tinian would never fade. The light, the heat, the screams. They had changed the war, and the war had changed them. Ahead lay Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the system of fire would reach its grim perfection. The success at Tinian turned fire into policy. Reports from the Marianas Campaign reached every corner of the Pacific Command. Engineers, ordnance officers, and marine strategists studied them line by line. The conclusion was unanimous. The flamethrower tank was no longer an experiment. It was a requirement. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service and Marine Tank Battalions received orders to standardize the design on the M4 Sherman chassis. The result was the POA CWS H-1, Pacific Ocean Areas Chemical Warfare Service H-1, Unlike the small and fragile Satan, this was a purpose-built machine, heavier, safer, and deadlier. The Sherman provided what the Stuart never could: range, protection, and endurance. Its thicker armor allowed crews to survive artillery near misses. Its larger frame held over 300 gallons of thickened fuel and multiple nitrogen pressure tanks. The new flamethrower projector could reach up to 150 yards under ideal conditions. Mounted coaxially with a .30 caliber machine gun, it gave the operator both suppression and fire in the same line of sight. Colonel George Unmacht's team in Hawaii oversaw the conversions, turning out dozens of POA CWS-H1s by the time of Iwo Jima. The weapon had grown from an improvisation into an assembly line product, a strange industrial expression of controlled terror. When the landings began on February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima's beaches were already a furnace of smoke and steel. The Japanese defenders had perfected their underground fortress strategy: 12 miles of tunnels, artillery chambers, and hidden command posts dug beneath Mount Suribachi. Traditional bombardment achieved little. Shells collapsed entrances, but the defenders simply opened new ones. Then the flamethrower tanks rolled forward. The reports are terse, written in the dry language of staff officers, but between the lines lies the horror. Flame tanks advanced with dozers to clear the way, each burst burning for seconds that felt like eternity. Caverns that had resisted weeks of artillery were sealed in minutes. Marines followed cautiously, sealing openings with demolitions. The combination of tank, flame, and engineer became the trinity of Pacific assault tactics. One officer on Iwo Jima noted in his after-action report, "Without the flame tank, many strong points would have required days to neutralize. Its effect on morale, both ours and the enemy's, cannot be overstated." By Okinawa, 2 months later, the doctrine was mature. The number of flame tanks per division increased. Refueling and maintenance depots were established behind the lines. Engineers designed flame-resistant storage drums and standardized burst patterns for different targets: bunkers, caves, trenches, or wooden villages. On Okinawa's ridges, the results were devastating. Japanese positions that once required full battalions to storm could now be cleared by one tank and a squad of engineers. Civilians, tragically caught in the same tunnels, suffered alongside soldiers. The weapon was brutally efficient and mercilessly impartial. For American commanders, it was victory through pragmatism. For those who witnessed it, it was something else entirely. "We stopped calling it a flamethrower," one crewman later said. "We just called it what it was: hell on wheels." When Okinawa fell in June 1945, the Pacific Flame Doctrine was complete. The United States had turned the science of combustion into a tool of war. Every assault plan for future invasions, including the projected invasion of Japan, included flame sections as a standard component. Fire had become a system. But systems, like fire, spread, and soon the enemy would learn to fight it back. The Japanese were quick to understand what had changed. After Saipan and Tinian, and especially after the reports from Iwo Jima, their commanders knew that conventional cave defense was no longer enough. The enemy had learned to burn the ground itself. In late 1944, engineering officers across the Imperial Japanese Army issued new construction directives. Tunnels would go deeper. Chambers would be built with stone baffles and water reservoirs. Cave entrances would twist, forming right-angled turns to break the reach of flame. Ventilation shafts were fitted with gravel screens to block burning fuel. Ammunition stores were moved farther inside, and escape tunnels, once an afterthought, became essential. They even prepared for psychological defense. Soldiers were instructed to close their eyes and cover their faces when flame tanks approached, to ignore the light and heat for as long as possible. Manuals urged calm, promising that a single burst does not always kill. But the reality was different. Few men could stay calm when liquid fire rolled toward them. The heat consumed oxygen. The roar shook the chest. Fire did not just burn, it erased courage. On Okinawa, Japanese tactics adapted further. Suicide squads armed with explosives waited for flame tanks to fire, then rushed from hidden gullies or storm drains to detonate beneath them. Some carried bamboo poles tipped with mines. Others hid under camouflage until the tanks passed, then attacked from the rear. Reports show that while a few tanks were destroyed this way, most attacks failed, stopped by vigilant riflemen who learned to protect the vehicles at all costs. The Americans adjusted in turn. Flame tanks now operated in pairs, backed by standard Shermans and covered by infantry on both sides. When darkness fell, engineers built berms around them, creating circular defenses to deter infiltrators. Crews slept inside their tanks, exhausted, surrounded by the smell of their own fuel. The logistical chain behind the flame tank was almost as complex as the machine itself. Fuel had to be thickened with napalm-like compounds on site, mixed in 55-gallon drums by chemical warfare units. Each tank required hundreds of gallons per mission, and refueling under fire was deadly work. Yet despite the danger, maintenance crews performed these tasks daily, often knee-deep in mud and surrounded by the constant thunder of mortars. But even as the system refined, the psychological toll deepened. Flame tank operators carried a particular burden. They had seen their work up close, not as numbers, but as images burned into memory. Many spoke little about it afterward. "You never forget the smell," one Marine said years later. "It doesn't wash off." To the infantry, flame tanks were salvation. To the men inside, they were isolation chambers, places where heat, noise, and duty merged into something beyond human scale. Few slept easily after missions. Some prayed that the war would end before their fuel ran out. When peace finally came in August 1945, the records of flame tank operations filled volume. Official summaries highlighted effectiveness and efficiency, but beneath the clinical tone were handwritten addenda, quiet comments from officers and engineers who had seen too much. Necessary, but terrible. The weapon worked. The heart did not. After the war, the United States would retain flamethrowers for decades, but never again on such a scale. The Pacific experience had proven their tactical worth and their human cost. The Japanese, too, recorded their lesson. Surviving officers wrote of a weapon that turned courage into futility, a force against which no spirit could stand. Fire had changed the physics of battle and the psychology of man. From the smoke of Okinawa rose the question that outlived the war itself. If victory demands fire, what does it leave behind in the hearts of those who lit it? In war, every invention begins as a problem to solve. The flamethrower tank began as desperation, a response to caves that would not yield, to enemies who would not surrender, and to terrain that turned every advance into slaughter. Yet what emerged was more than a weapon. It was a transformation of how modern armies thought about fear itself. The Pacific flame tanks were never mass-produced wonders. They were handmade machines, improvised from existing armor and human will. They didn't win battles alone. Artillery, air power, and infantry still did the heavy lifting. But in the darkest corners of the Pacific, inside the tunnels, the coral ridges, the blackened hills, they became the final argument of fire. The crews who manned them carried no illusions. They knew what they unleashed. They saw what was left behind after each burst. And though their reports spoke of neutralized caves and effective operations, their faces told another story, one of exhaustion and quiet dread. For them, victory was measured in seconds of silence after the roar. Historians would later debate the ethics, the necessity, and the legacy of the flame tank. Some called it inhumane, others indispensable. The truth lies somewhere between, in the narrow space between survival and mercy that defines all wars. What cannot be debated is its impact. The flame tank marked the end of an era where courage alone could hold ground. It signaled the rise of technological domination, where chemistry, engineering, and logistics decided who lived and who burned. When the last bursts died on Okinawa and the Pacific fell silent, the smoke hung like memory. Out of that haze came a lesson older than any machine, that progress in war always carries a shadow. Fire had given men the power to conquer stone, but it had also forced them to look into the heart of what conquest really means. And long after the flames faded, the echo of that fire still lingers, not on the battlefield, but in the conscience of history itself.